Do you know who I am? I built half this city. One call and this hospital loses its operating license by morning. That's your right. You're still not entering this trauma bay. She was not supposed to matter. That's what Chairman Lim Dae-won believed when he raised his hand in that corridor and walked away, straightening his cuffs. She was a pregnant doctor on a Tuesday afternoon, a minor inconvenience in an otherwise manageable day. He was wrong. And that mistake, that single, arrogant, catastrophically miscalculated mistake, would cost him everything he had spent 58 years building. Seoul Central Hospital's trauma floor never slept. Monitors kept time like a second heartbeat. The air carried the sharp edge of antiseptic and the quieter weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. The staff moved fast and spoke efficiently, because on this floor a wasted word was a wasted second, and a wasted second had a price nobody wanted to pay. It was not a place for the uncertain. It was not a place for the loud. It rewarded only one thing: the ability to stay calm when everything around you was not. Dr. Seo Yuna had worked this floor for 7 years. At 33, she was the one the residents called before they called the attending. She was the one who knew which patient was turning before the monitor said so, which family in the waiting room was 30 seconds from breaking down, which junior doctor needed a quiet word, and which one needed a direct order. She moved through the floor 8 months pregnant, her white coat open at the front, her badge reading Seo Yuna, M.D., emergency medicine in crisp black letters. But her lower back ached from the 4th hour of every shift onward. She never mentioned it. She simply pressed one hand briefly to her side between rooms, exhaled slowly, and kept moving. Nobody on this floor knew much about her life outside the hospital. She didn't talk about where she grew up. She didn't talk about her husband. When people asked, she smiled in a way that answered nothing and redirected with a question of her own. What none of them knew, what nobody at Seoul Central had ever been told, was that the name on her badge was not the name she was born with. It was not the name that made men in 3 countries pick up the phone on the first ring. Her husband had a different name, a name that did not appear in any police database in Korea, Japan, or China, a name spoken carefully in certain rooms and not spoken at all in others. As she had asked him 6 years ago on the night they married for exactly one thing: "Keep your world away from mine. Let me just be a doctor." He had honored that without exception. He had never once let his world touch her floor. What she did not know, what she had never thought to ask, was whether he had let his eyes follow her there. He had. Every single shift, for 6 years, through a man she had never noticed standing near the elevator bank in a dark suit, watching. The doors at the far end of the corridor burst open at 2:47 in the afternoon. The man who walked through them wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most residents made in 4 months. His silver hair was swept back. His right hand was wrapped loosely in a restaurant cloth, a shallow cut from a broken wine glass at lunch, and the kind that needed a bandage and nothing more. He scanned the trauma floor the way men scan rooms they have already decided belong to them. His name was Lim Dae-won, and he had just walked into the worst decision of his life. What followed lasted 4 minutes. What it set in motion lasted the rest of his life. He was 58, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that had been fitted to his frame by someone who charged by the hour. He had 3 billion won of donated capital in this building. He had a framed letter from the board of directors to prove it. He walked like both of those facts were visible from a distance. He scanned the trauma floor and found the nearest resident. "I need a bay. Now. Not in an hour. Now." The resident, 26 years old and 3 months into his rotation, looked at the cloth around Lim's hand and began carefully explaining triage. Lim walked past him mid-sentence. Yuna stepped out of Bay 3. She positioned herself in the corridor with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had made this kind of decision before and found it straightforward. She was 8 months pregnant. She was holding a chart. She did not raise her voice. Bay 3 has a 40-year-old in post-cardiac arrest. He cannot be moved. If you have a laceration, I'll have a nurse bring supplies to the waiting area on the ground floor. Lim looked at her, the way certain men look at things that have unexpectedly started talking back. Do you know who I am? Yes, Yuna said. You're still not coming through. What followed was loud and one-sided. Lim moved through it with the practiced fluency of a man who had used his name as a weapon for decades. The donations, the board connections, her badge, her license, her future, her audacity. Yuna absorbed every word without shifting her weight. She had heard versions of this before. She knew how it ended when she held the line, and she knew how it ended when she didn't. She had no intention of finding out again. So Lim's palm connected with the side of her face. The sound was wrong, too sharp for a hospital, too final. It split the fluorescent quiet of the trauma floor like something breaking that was not designed to break. Yuna's head turned. The chart hit the floor. Both her hands went to her stomach. Immediately, involuntarily, the oldest instinct, and the entire floor went silent. Not quiet. Silent. A nurse at the station pressed both hands to her mouth. A first-year resident flattened himself against the wall. At the far end of the corridor, Dr. Park, the attending on duty, watched and did not move. Lim straightened his jacket cuffs. He told a passing nurse to find him a competent physician. He walked out. No one stopped him. That silence, that collective, witnessed, unbroken silence, was the most damning thing that happened that afternoon. Hospital Director Choi arrived 20 minutes later. He did not check on Yuna. He met Lim in the lobby and shook his hand. By evening, a formal suspension notice had been delivered to Yuna's inbox, effective immediately. 2 security staff walked her to her locker. Not roughly, just firmly, the way people act when they've been told to make something look official. She handed over her badge. She walked back through the trauma corridor for the last time, past Bay 3, where a 40-year-old construction worker was breathing steadily because she had held that door. The front entrance opened. Cold air. Rain. She stood on the wet pavement, pulled her coat across her stomach, and did not call her husband. She got in a cab and went home. Behind her, in the corridor she had just left, a man in a dark suit who had not moved from the elevator bank since Lim arrived, reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and sent a single message to a single contact. 1 photograph. No words. If you felt that, if that silence hit you the way it was supposed to, you already know this story isn't over. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you have done if you were standing in that corridor? And if someone you know needs to hear a story about quiet strength and what it actually costs to underestimate the wrong person, share this. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that did not appear in any real estate listing. The Han River stretched below it, wide and dark, its surface catching the city lights and scattering them like something broken. Kang Junho sat at the long glass table facing the window, jacket folded over the chair beside him, sleeves rolled precisely to the forearm. He was 38 years old. He wore no rings, no chain, nothing that caught light or invited attention. Only a brushed steel watch on his left wrist, plain and expensive, and never mentioned. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not stillness exactly, but something deeper than stillness. The kind of face that had decided long ago that expression was a resource, and resources were not wasted. His organization had no official name. His photograph existed in no police database in Korea, Japan, or China. He had spent 15 years building the kind of invisibility that money alone could not purchase. The kind that required patience and discipline, and the willingness to let other men believe they were the most powerful person in the room. Min Jae entered without knocking. He never knocked. He crossed the room, placed a phone face up on the glass table, and stepped back without a word. One photograph. Yuna in the corridor, both hands pressed to her stomach. Head turned from the blow. The clipboard splayed open on the floor beside her, its pages scattered like something interrupted mid-sentence. Junho looked at it for a long time. He did not speak. He did not move. He set the phone face down on the table with the slow, deliberate care of a man managing the only thing in the room he could still control. Then he picked up his tea and took one measured sip. The temperature in the room changed anyway. Min Jae found a point on the far wall and studied it carefully. 6 years ago, when on the night they married, Yuna had taken his hands across a candle-lit table and looked at him with the particular directness that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. "I don't want your world near mine," she had said. "Promise me." "You have my word," he had said. He had kept it, every day without exception, for 6 years. He had never sent anyone to her floor with instructions to act. He had never let his name cast a shadow over the hospital walls. He had stationed Min Jae there not to interfere, never to interfere, but simply to watch, to be present in the way that Junho himself could not be in the world she had asked him to stay out of. She had asked him not to act. She had never asked him not to see. The distinction he had always known would one day matter. He picked up his phone and made 4 calls. A banker in Apgujeong set down his wine glass very carefully, as though the stem had become fragile, and did not pick it up again. A city official in Yeouido closed his office door and did not come out for an hour. A construction site foreman in Mapo called his entire crew off the building before dawn, citing nothing. A man in Busan listened, said, "Understood," and disconnected. Across the city, in a private room at Gaon, Seoul's most expensive restaurant, where the menu had no prices because the clientele did not ask, Chairman Lim Dae-won was laughing. He was recounting the afternoon to 2 business associates, then his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who has spent decades confusing the absence of consequences with the absence of accountability. When the waiter arrived with the first bottle, Lim placed his card on the silver tray without looking up. The waiter returned 2 minutes later with the expression of someone who wished he worked anywhere else. Declined. Lim smiled, assuming a banking error, and reached for his phone to call his CFO. 4 missed calls already. He set the phone face down and waved for a second card. He would not be ignoring those calls by morning. By morning, he would understand that a banking error was the most innocent explanation available to him, and that the truth was considerably worse. Lim's penthouse phone rang at 6:04 a.m. He had been asleep for 3 hours. He answered expecting his CFO. Instead, it was his private banker in Singapore, speaking in the measured tone of a man delivering information he did not want to deliver. All 3 offshore accounts were empty. Not withdrawn, not transferred. Empty, as though the balances had been a clerical error that someone had quietly corrected overnight. The jurisdictions had been chosen specifically for their opacity, for the layers of distance they placed between Lim's name and his money. Those layers apparently had not been sufficient. He was still on the phone when the second call came in. His Gangnam-gu project, a 47-story mixed-use tower 8 months into construction, his flagship, the development that was supposed to define his legacy on the Seoul skyline, had been halted by an emergency injunction filed at 6 a.m. by a law firm whose name he did not recognize. His head of security sent a resignation by text at 6:18. No explanation, no notice period. Just a message, and then silence. Lim sat at the edge of his bed in yesterday's shirt and understood for the first time that what was happening was not an error. He called an emergency session of Seoul Central's board for 9 o'clock, expecting to formalize Yuna's dismissal and neutralize any legal exposure from the previous afternoon. 3 of the 7 board members did not appear. Two who did arrive recused themselves within minutes, citing conflicts they declined to specify. Director Choi, who had shaken Lim's hand in the lobby less than 18 hours earlier, sat at the far end of the table and did not once make eye contact. The session dissolved before it formally began. At 10:15, Seoul Central's legal department filed a criminal assault complaint with the district prosecutor's office on behalf of Dr. Seo Yuna. Lim learned about it from a journalist who called for comment before his own lawyer did. The lawyer arrived at 11. He delivered the financial news last in the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed the words and still finds them difficult. Every major development Lim had completed in the last 11 years sat on land that had been cleared and rezoned through a network of intermediary companies. Those companies, traced back through their filings, connected to a single holding group registered in the British Virgin Islands. The holding group's silent majority owner was a man named Kang. Lim did not recognize the name. His lawyer did, and his lawyer resigned by 2 o'clock that afternoon and did not take any of Lim's subsequent calls. By evening, Lim had reached out to 3 men with reputations for making inconvenient situations disappear. The first listened, asked one question, "Who sent the envelope?" and left the money on the table untouched. The second never arrived. The third, a heavy-set man known for taking cases no one else would touch, looked at the black envelope Lim had found outside his penthouse door that morning, a single Korean character pressed into dark wax, and set it down. "There is no one in this country who will take this," he said. "Not for any amount." "Why?" Lim's voice was no longer the voice from yesterday's corridor. The man looked at him with something between pity and contempt. "Because the man who sent that doesn't send warnings," he said quietly. "He sends conclusions." Lim drove to Gimpo Airport at midnight. He had cash. He had a destination. He had a plan, the kind of plan that feels solid in a moving car at night and nowhere else. The private terminal was dark when he arrived. He pulled onto the tarmac and saw 3 black vehicles already parked in the shadows, engines off, lights out, as though they had been waiting there for hours, which they had. You already know Lim isn't leaving that tarmac the way he arrived, the room he never expected to walk into, and the man he never expected to find sitting at his own table. Subscribe right now, like this, if you felt that last line. And tell us in the comments, did Lim ever actually have a way out? Or was it over the moment he walked through those hospital doors? 6 men stepped out of the vehicles, no raised voices, no weapons visible. They moved to Lim with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this many times and found it unremarkable. 2 at each arm, 1 ahead, 1 behind. The bag went over his head before he finished his first sentence. They drove for 20 minutes. Nobody spoke. The car was warm and completely silent, and that silence was worse than anything Lim could have filled it with. When the bag came off, he was seated at a table. He recognized the room before his eyes fully adjusted. The low lighting, the dark paneling, the particular arrangement of the chairs. The private dining room at Cheongdam House, Seoul's most exclusive members-only club, had the room Lim himself reserved for conversations he did not want on any record. His usual table, his usual decanter on the sideboard, open and breathing, the wine he kept on standing order. The room had been set as though for a dinner he had arranged and simply forgotten to attend. Sitting at the head of his table, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, one hand resting loosely around a wine glass, was a man Lim had never seen before. He was younger than Lim expected, unhurried in the way that people are unhurried when outcomes have already been decided. He did not introduce himself. He did not stand. He reached across the table and slid a leather folder to the space in front of Lim's hands. Lim opened it. Full asset transfer documents for every remaining property. Dissolution papers for all 3 holding companies. And beneath them are printed on a single sheet of matte paper, a photograph. Yuna in the corridor, both hands on her stomach. Head turned from the blow. Clipboard on the floor. The man across the table placed one finger on the photograph and left it there for a moment. Then he looked up. "You walked into my hospital," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely level. "You raised your hand to my wife. You did it in front of witnesses and cameras, and you walked away believing that money makes certain things acceptable." He lifted the wine glass, Lim's wine from Lim's decanter, and held it without drinking. "I built this city's silence for 15 years. Every contractor who moved without complaint, every official who looked the other way, every piece of land your towers stand on." He set the glass down. "And I let you build because you were useful and because you stayed in your lane." A pause, not for effect, simply because the next words required their own space. "You left your lane." Lim's instincts defaulted to the only tool he had ever possessed. He raised his voice. He cited connections, names, the kind of leverage he had used his entire career to make rooms bend toward him. The man across the table listened without changing his expression. He did not interrupt. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who had already heard everything Lim might say and found none of it relevant. When Lim finished, the man opened the folder to the first page and placed a pen on top of it. Lim signed everything. Every page, every transfer, every dissolution. Now, by the final document, his signature had deteriorated into something that barely resembled itself. The man across the table watched without expression, without satisfaction, without anything at all. When the last page was signed, he closed the folder, aligned the edges once against the table, and nodded to someone behind Lim's left shoulder. The bag went back over Lim's head, and then quietly, almost gently, in the tone of someone leaving a fact on record rather than twisting a blade, the man said one more thing. "She never asked me to do this. I want you to know that. She still doesn't know I'm here." A pause. "This is not her justice. This is mine." 1 moment left. The arrest, the reckoning. Anna in the room on the 7th floor where everything that was taken gets returned, in ways Lim could never have calculated and Yuna never expected. Subscribe now. Like this if Junho just became your favorite character. And tell us in the comments, did Lim deserve a warning? Or was it always going to end exactly here? They pushed Lim out of the vehicle at 4:47 a.m. He hit wet pavement and rolled once before stopping. He tore the bag from his head and looked up at the concrete ceiling of a parking structure, fluorescent lights humming above him in the pre-dawn dark. It took him a moment to recognize where he was. Then he saw the elevator signage, the hospital logo on the pillar to his left, the faded painted arrows pointing toward the emergency entrance. Seoul Central Hospital, level B2, the exact spot where, 36 hours earlier, Dr. Seo Yuna had stood in the rain holding a paper bag with her personal belongings, badge surrendered, escorted out of the building she had given 7 years of her life to. Lim was wearing the same suit he had worn to dinner 2 nights ago. He had nothing else. The police vehicles arrived 2 minutes later, 3 of them, moving without sirens. The officers stepped out with the calm efficiency of people who had been briefed thoroughly and expected no resistance. The charges were read aloud in the yellow light of the parking structure: criminal assault, bribery of public officials, and 11 years of documented financial fraud filed anonymously with the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office at 4 a.m. that morning. The documentation, his lawyer would later say, it was the most comprehensively prepared submission the prosecutor's office had received in a decade. Every transaction, every payment, every name. Lim did not resist. There was nothing left to resist with. Director Choi cleared out his office that same morning. He was not fired. Termination would have required a board motion, paperwork, process. The new hospital ownership, quietly transferred 4 months ago through a holding company the board had never fully investigated, simply declined to renew his directorship when it lapsed at the end of the quarter. He was offered alternative employment within the facility. The maintenance department had been short-staffed for some time. He was currently on the third floor with a mop and a cart, working his way toward the elevator bank. The private suite on the 7th floor faced east, and when the morning light came through the wide windows slowly, the way good things arrive, without announcement, without asking permission, filling the room so gradually that by the time you noticed it, it had already been there a while. Flowers on the windowsill. The sound of monitors, gentle now, nothing urgent. And beneath everything else, the sound of a newborn breathing, small and steady and entirely new. Yuna held her daughter against her chest and looked out at the city. Dark hair, her grandmother's eyes, lungs that had announced their arrival to the entire 7th floor and shown no sign of apology. She was 4 hours old and already had opinions. She was perfect. Yuna breathed slowly and held her closer. Junho stood near the doorway with his hands folded, looking at his daughter with an expression Yuna had never seen on his face in 6 years of marriage. Something open, unguarded, fully, completely human. As though the careful architecture he maintained everywhere else had simply failed to load in this room, and he hadn't noticed and wouldn't have cared if he had. Yuna had found out about the hospital that morning. The new directorship paperwork had come through her physician inbox. Standard administrative notification, new ownership header, holding company name, she recognized immediately. She had looked across the room at him for a long time. He had not looked away. "You promised," she said. "I promised not to interfere with your work," he said. "You still have your work, your patients, your floor." A pause, measured and unhurried, the way he said everything. "Yeah, I just changed who owns the building." She laughed. Small and tired and entirely real. The first real laugh in 3 days. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than humor, from relief and exhaustion, and the particular absurdity of loving someone whose version of keeping a promise looks like this. He crossed the room and stood beside the bed. He looked at his daughter for a long time. The city outside was waking up. Han River catching the early light, the skyline doing what it always did, indifferent and relentless and ongoing. Then he looked at Yuna. "You good?" She nodded. "I'm good." He nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they've been quietly carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally been given permission to set it down. Across the city, in a holding room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting and the specific silence of consequences that cannot be undone, Lim Dae-won sat in yesterday's suit and thought about a corridor. A pregnant woman. A clipboard on the floor, the way she had not flinched, the way she had not begged, the way she had simply looked at him with complete calm and held her ground as though she already knew something he didn't. She had known nothing. She had simply been herself, composed and competent, and entirely unbothered by his name or his money or the weight he believed he carried into every room. He had mistaken her calm for weakness. He had looked at her steadiness and read it as someone who could be moved. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about everything that followed from it. The quietest people in the room are never the weakest. They are simply the ones who haven't decided to move yet. And sometimes, the people who love them move first. If this story stayed with you, if Yuna's calm, Junho's silence, or that final moment on the 7th floor hit somewhere real, then you already know this is the kind of storytelling worth coming back for. Subscribe right now, not later, now. Because the next story is already coming, and it will find you only if you're here. Like this, if the ending gave you everything you needed. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength is still strength, and that the right people are always watching, even when you don't know it. And leave us a comment. Which moment in this story will stay with you longest? The slap? The silence? The signing? Or a man standing in a doorway looking at his daughter, finally letting his face say what he never says out loud? We read every single one. See you in the next story.